And it hits me, oh my gosh, this is that triangle.
You know, there's explanation for everything that occurred in the Rendlesham Forest incident that doesn't involve aliens at all.
It was completely silent. It comes right over our heads.
He saw a classic flying saucer really standing in the clearing.
He turned over to my father and held his hand, and he looked in his eyes and he said, "We're not alone."
Welcome to Podcast UFO for our live show. We're live every Wednesday at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on the Dark Matter Radio Network. Please remember to visit the website podcastufo.com for past episodes, blogs, and forums. During the show, feel free to participate live in our chat room. And don't forget to like us on our very active Facebook page.
Hello and welcome to our show. I'm Martin Willis, your host, and I'm coming at you live right now from Sochi, Russia, where it is 3 a.m. Our guest tonight is Ryan Mullahy. He's going to be talking about New Hampshire UFOs. But before our guest, we have Alejandro Rojas coming up with the news in just a minute. I want to thank all you listeners who support the show. If you can't support the show, we still appreciate you. And you can always listen to the show for free every Wednesday evening at 8 to 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time right here on podcastufo.com. And you can also jump in the chat room there. We also run the full shows as a podcast on the Dark Matter Digital Network on Thursdays at 10 to midnight Eastern Standard Time. How are you, Alejandro?
I'm doing good. How are you doing out there?
I'm doing pretty good. You know, it's absolutely beautiful in Sochi. It's tropical where I am staying. Like there's banana trees, palm trees, all that right on the Black Sea. And then you drive an hour west and you're where they had the 2014 Winter Olympics. And I was standing on snow, just hours ago. And it's absolutely beautiful. It's the Caucasus Mountains. And you are at where they had the Olympics, you were totally surrounded by mountains. It's really, really beautiful. Went up on one of those trams to the very top and too bad it was foggy, but you could still see it was just gorgeous.
Yeah, that's awesome. It sounds pretty incredible. I mean, I've seen lots of beach pictures from the area.
Yeah.
But so it's hard to imagine. And then, of course, the Olympics. So it's kind of weird that they have that beach and snow so close to each other.
Yeah, the town itself, though, is really big. I was talking to a guy that speaks a little bit of English here. And he said that it's 145 kilometers wide. And it feels like that. I mean, you're in the car for like ever to go across the, from where you first go through Sochi. You have to go through like a place where they check your passport and all that when you first come into it. And that was a good hour and a half, 2 hours from the center of town. And that's all just spread, right across this beautiful landscape in the mountains on the Black Sea. Best way to put it. Really cool.
How cool. Sounds awesome.
Yep. But you can't get to the Black Sea from the town. You have to go, I think it's north a little bit before you get to any like public beach. Everything else is privately owned. If you want to go to a hotel or something like that, you can get to the beach.
Yeah. Well, how is it? How are people there?
Really friendly here. I think it's just because there's more Americans come to this part than they do in the town I'm generally staying in. So it's there's a lot of like English speaking people and a lot of the like restaurants. They actually have restaurants here, and some American restaurants is pretty funny, McDonald's, stuff like that. But they have where you can you'll see the Russian name for restaurant, and then they'll have the English spelling for it below. So they're English is acceptable here, and they don't want to kill me like they do in the other town.
Good.
So, and Putin's here.
That's a good thing.
Yeah.
That's what Putin is there.
Yeah, he's at his compound.
He may want to kill you.
He might, yeah. But he's not returning any calls. And I wanted to talk to him.
Oh, you tried calling?
Yeah, I wanted to talk to him about the way we had to bribe to get our dog in at the Moscow airport, second year in a row.
Oh, you did?
Oh, yeah.
Last time you had to do this? Does the bribe cost less because it's a little dog? It's a little chihuahua.
Well, they say both times this happened. but different things. They said, this time they said you're missing a form, and we very carefully filled out all the right forms, did everything through the agriculture department and everything. That did it perfectly, and so the form they said we were missing that cost $100 to let us in, it does not exist.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So you just have to keep that in mind if you're traveling here or whatever. You have to have a little extra money on you.
Yeah, Pat, especially if you're traveling with a Chihuahua.
That's right. Deadly Chihuahua. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you met Peanut.
I have met Peanut. I like Peanut. Peanut's cool.
He's a great dog. Love that dog.
He is cool.
All right. So what's going on for UFO news this week?
UFO news. So a couple cool stories we have out there. I think one of them is kind of fun, and I think it'll be good to, give your listeners a heads up on. And this is the Army Chief of Staff warning ROTC cadets about hybrid armies and little green men. Wild, huh?
It really is quite a title.
But it's not what it sounds like. So, and this is kind of and hopefully the Russians don't catch on to us talking about this, because this is a little critical of them, because these terms, hybrid army and little green men, they don't mean like alien human hybrids and little green men are attacking and they have to get ready for it. What it does mean is that these are terms that means something else in military terms. So a hybrid army, for instance, that one's not, you can kind of see that more of being a term meaning something else. And what it means are armies, kind of the non-conventional nature of armies these days. So, for instance, you have non-state combatants, kind of like ISIS, and you have terrorists. And so they're hybrid because they're these armies that have all of these different components. One of those components being cyber warfare also. So that's what hybrid armies means when he's warning people about hybrid armies. Little green men actually is a term for these unacknowledged Russian armies. And I'll bet you if you ask, and maybe you should try this, I don't know if you should do this when Putin is around, but ask some of the people in Russia there if they think that the Russian army has troops in the Ukraine, or if they had them in Crimea, because the Russian government denies that they have troops there. However, the international community is well aware that they have troops. However, the troops they have over there do not have insignia on their uniforms, and they're driving unmarked vehicles, and they're wearing these green uniforms. So they're called little green men. It's a term that's more familiar, and in fact, if you Google it as far as armies, you're going to find other stories out there that the news has written about the little green men. So it is a common military term for those guys. And so when he said this straight up, he said, you're going to be dealing with terrorists, you're going to be dealing with hybrid armies, little green men, tribes, all of this stuff. He's very straightforward, this Army general who told these ROTC guys this, but he wasn't talking about aliens at all. And the reason this became such a big deal, or why I'm bringing it up, is because, of course, a lot of the UFO sites went crazy. They assumed about aliens. And really, for many people, I can't blame them for, they're kind of weird terms. That they would be adopted into military terminology is interesting. But, I mean, they even have Wikipedia entries. They're all over. It's just well known. Funny thing is, it's just the other day, I think it was Friday, the Army Times wrote a story about how UFO enthusiasts have gone wild over these terms and what the general has said. And they even referenced my story at openminds.tv as someone who was trying to debunk or let people know what those terms really mean. So I got a bit of a kudos from the Army Times there. But, this is kind of turned into a funny story. And there are some, UFO sites out there who are just saying, no, it's a conspiracy. I don't care what you say. These are, he's talking about aliens.
Even after all that, people will just hang on to that. And you know what? I wonder if we're going to be hearing about this like a year from now. Same thing. Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, we're going to be hearing out about it over the next few months, I'm sure, because there are some noted UFO researchers who have large followings who are still sticking to this idea that he meant aliens.
Jeez.
What can you do, huh?
I almost want you to say the names. You know,
well, people can go find that
Yeah.
out. And if you're a follower of one of these people, you're either saying, oh, man, that person got it wrong, or you're saying, Alejandro's fallen for it. He's a sucker that, this other person is right, and the Army is talking about aliens. So,
yeah, I don't know. It's good that they referenced you because they're trying to keep the story straight.
That's cool.
But,
yeah.
I wonder when he said that if he had any idea at all that something like that would happen.
I don't think so. He's really straightforward, and he just says, his whole speech. I think that these terms are really part of their lexicon, and that, when they are on their day-to-day discussion talking about things, they're using these terms, just like we would use the term, let's say, experiencer. I interviewed, this guy who works on that, and he uses the term experiencer. Someone who doesn't know, this field and wouldn't know what the heck is he talking about. What's an experiencer, but we know what it is, and we use the term on a regular basis. So I think he just is so familiar with that term and using it every day in his regular talk that at least at the time it eluded him that the civilians in the audience and that would read, or hear his comment would have no clue what the hell he's talking about and think he's talking about aliens.
So how did this hit the media in the beginning anyway?
Oh, it was the Army Times, actually. The Army Times wrote a story about his talk. This is the Army's chief of staff, I'm not sure if I mentioned that, who made this speech. And he was at a university giving a speech to ROTC cadets on the 100th anniversary of the ROTC. And so it was a special event where he gave this talk, and they essentially were writing the story straightforward. And among everything that they wrote that he had said, among the things he said is about how to be leaders and some of the threats that or things that they're going to be facing in the future. And so they had this quote in there. And so it was an Army Times story originally. Then the video got uploaded to YouTube of him saying it. And it just took off from there.
Well, I'm assuming that the Army didn't use that as a title. Am I correct?
No, they did not. In fact, the original story, let me look it up, actually. I've got it right here. The original story, the title was Army Chief to Leaders, Winning is Everything in Combat. So,
That's
yeah,
how it
the
started.
title did not... Yeah, so it was just about his talk. It really, you had to actually read the story. And I think what happened is, someone read the story and tipped off the UFO researcher who first, felt it was aliens and stuff. And it's funny because now when you look at the original story, you can scroll to the bottom and they have a story of this general with an alien. And that's a link to their story about how it set off UFO enthusiasts, as they put it.
Wow. Amazing. Well, we'll watch how that unravels. So what else is happening?
What else is happening? You made note of a very clear UFO image that Roger Marsh from MUFON had posted. This was from a sighting in Turkey in a town called Antalya, a town that is not unlike the one you're in now. It's a beach town where kind of a vacation place. And there was somebody out there, and he saw a shiny object in the sky. He said at first he thought maybe it was a helium-filled metallic balloon, but it moved off to the north, and then it came back, and it hovered over the sea. So he got a few shots with his nice camera with a zoom lens, and you see this metallic object. So, yeah, that's kind of some interesting pictures. He took about 6 pictures, and we have links to all of the pictures, and we have a few of those pictures and the zoom in on the object in the pictures. However, some people have noted, and these pictures are so clear that you could really zoom in, and some people have noted that it looks like an A, like a silver A-shaped balloon. And if you go Google, letters like silver mylar balloons that are letter shaped, they are out there. So it very well could be the letter A, an A-shaped mylar balloon. So
they actually sell
clear.
mylar balloons in big letters.
Yeah, I think in practically every letter.
Yeah, I was noticing that, and I would probably say that you're right. That's probably what it is.
Yeah, so I think that's, a lot of people are feeling that's what it is who are typing. But yeah, you can see there's like these 40-inch letter A balloon, which is a fairly popular balloon. But they have, lots of shiny balloons that are in different, probably every letter of the alphabet, but that are so... And some of them are pretty big, like 3-4 feet long or something like that. So, yeah, that's probably what this is.
It probably is just like a weird weather wind pattern or something like that.
Yeah.
You never know.
And people don't realize, the wind does that. The wind at different altitudes, the winds go different directions.
That's right.
So if you're a UFO researcher and you go look at the wind and it says there was a wind at 5 miles an hour to the north, well, that's most likely ground level. You would have to find an almanac or something else that shows at different levels because, you might have seen clouds that are blowing in one direction and then clouds that are higher than that going completely the opposite direction.
Yes.
That happens.
If you're ballooning, like in a hot air balloon, I just had some friends that used to have one, and they used to tell me they used to be in competitions, and they had what they called the hair balloon, and everybody had to get as close to the hair balloon as they could. It was just a balloon with a long ribbon hanging. And that's what they'd do. They'd go up and down till they hit the right wind currents to get toward that direction. It's pretty interesting.
Yeah, that's pretty cool.
Not that the winds blow in every single direction, but there are, different shifts here and there. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But anyway, it's a great picture. It's too bad it's a letter. Yeah. Well,
most likely that one is a letter. But another story that we just posted yesterday that people should check out. This is an old famous sighting. It's from 1994. It's during a Michigan UFO flap, and where there were like 300 witnesses to UFO sightings in the area. This one in particular was near the town of Holland in Ottawa County. But this is really cool because MUFON, Roger Marsh posted this, but MUFON posted the 9/11 operator tapes in a YouTube. So the audio's in this YouTube, but Roger wrote up a story and we posted it on our site. It's just called the 9/11 operator tapes describe 1994 Michigan UFO flap. But these are really fun, to hear these 9/11 calls from people calling in these UFO sightings from 1994.
Wow. I love those old cases that he keeps writing about.
Uh-huh. I know it's fun. I mean, so many of these cases are so interesting. Some people complain, well, there's no picture, there's no video. Well, often the pictures and videos are not that impressive anyway, and a lot of the best cases come down to credible witness testimony. So, yeah, I think they're really interesting, and especially if they're in your area, or they're a case that you're particularly interested in. In fact, we've already had at least one person commenting that, I was there in the area and I remember seeing this.
Oh, wow. Yes, I talked to someone that had a, pardon me, someone just messaged me in the message board that I sound very nasally, and I do. I'm just not used to talking in the middle of the night. So, yeah, we are live again. Anyway.
Well, yeah, so what time is it there?
It is 3:34 a.m.
So you kind of had to get up in the middle of the night to do the show.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I plan on doing that. I'm just sure that I'm going to have better internet where I'm at the other weeks.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, I appreciate. That's it for the news tonight?
That's it for the news tonight.
All right. Or today, whatever it is.
Today, this morning. Yeah, whatever it is, wherever you may be.
That's right. I've heard that before. All right, man. Well, have a good one.
All right, you too.
All right. Okay, so our guest coming up, a little bit about him. He's Ryan Mullahy. He's a return guest. He's been on before. He's the founder of New Hampshire UFO Research, and he's been studying the UFO phenomena in the state of New Hampshire and New England for 18 years. We're going to be talking all about that. Plus, he has some new information about Pease Air Force Base that was in Newington, New Hampshire. It's a defunct base, but I have a little bit to say about that myself. And Ryan's also given a presentation. I saw him in the Exeter UFO Festival at the Exeter Town Hall, and there's the Exeter incident. I'm sure you're familiar with that. That's a great story. We'll be touching on that a little bit as well. And he's been on Behind the Paranormal, public radio, this show here, and Mac Maloney's X-Files. And if anyone's ever wants to listen to a great show, Mac Maloney does a great show every week. And he's on the Dark Matter Digital Network as well. Good guy, like Mac. Anyway, how you doing, Ryan?
I'm doing great, Martin. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for hanging in while we have had all these technical difficulties.
No problem.
Yeah, it's the live show just seems to be going in and out. I have someone working on it, so if you're listening live and you can hear me now, hang in where you have someone trying to manually turn on the server. It keeps going off and on. But anyway, Ryan, how's everything going for you?
Everything's great. How's Russia?
It's interesting. Very interesting. Can you tell the listener that may not have heard you before your background and how you got interested in UFOs?
Sure. In 1998, I was traveling through New Hampshire with a few friends and had a daytime UFO sighting, and that really sparked my interest in starting to look into UFOs in the state of New Hampshire as well as New England, and that was really the catalyst for me to start doing research into UFOs.
Well, can you explain that sighting?
Sure. We had taken a trip to New Hampshire just to do a little shopping on, like a Sunday afternoon, and we were returning to Massachusetts, where I lived at the time, on Route 13, and we were getting close to the Mass border, and basically we were just driving down, an interstate highway sort of road, and just a bit to the right of our car, just above the tree line, we saw a yellow, sparkling object that suddenly appeared and dropped down into the woods off to the right of the road with kind of a swinging motion. And we stopped the car dead in the middle of the road, and all three of us saw it. There was three of us in the vehicle, and we just kind of looked at each other and were just like, what was that? And, kind of have a quick conversation about it and decided it probably wasn't a good idea to go into the woods, and just continued on, to Massachusetts, and that was it.
So it's funny how someone like yourself, and same with me, had a sighting that was just kind of like unbelievable, or mine was, and kind of like changed their lives, and then other people, they're just not interested. It's really quite amazing. It really sparked my curiosity about the whole situation. And it sounds like it might have done the same with you.
It did. I agree. I found it just very fascinating, and, it set me on my journey to I said to myself after that, I said, well, geez, this is so fascinating. I want to try and understand what I saw. So I started looking around for good information on UFOs in New Hampshire and New England, and that kind of started me on my journey of research.
Wow. And you have lived in New Hampshire. You said you were driving through New Hampshire, but have you lived in New Hampshire a long time?
I've been in New Hampshire for about 10 years.
I see. And when we first talked, you had uncovered the truth about that great UFO photo in the clouds in New Hampshire, stereopticon view.
The alleged oldest known UFO photo.
That's right. For the person that you were on such a long time talking about that, why don't you chat about that a little bit?
Sure. Well, there's a photo that's been circulating for quite some time, or had been, on UFO sites, and every once in a while people would write about it, whatnot. That was claimed to be the oldest known UFO photo, and so I was always intrigued by it, the photo, because it was so old. Because I believe it was I don't have the date in front of me. I believe it was about 1870 that the photo was taken. It was a very long time. It was the first expedition to the top of Mount Washington when the photo was taken. And so it was a photo that I was always fascinated by, and I would look into here and there, and I would kind of hit a brick wall and kind of leave it alone and go back to it. And then eventually I was able to find out I came across the names of the photographers, and then once I had that information, it led me to more information about this expedition that was at the top of Mount Washington where the photo was taken. And it turned out that two photographers had traveled with the Army Corps to the top of Mount Washington to document the expedition, and a series of photos were taken. I believe there was about 41 photos that were after the fact that were sold as a set, and they were stereoscopic photos. And so basically just through my research, I was able to come across the actual photo list, which listed the particular photo that had been claimed to be a UFO as frost architecture. Now, on the surface of Mount Washington at the top, it's so cold, and between the cold and the precipitation, there's these ice structures that will just form at the top. And so what this photo was the photographers taking a photo of these big formations up there. So it was not a UFO, and there was actually a book written about the expedition as well, and there was a whole chapter devoted to the photography, and there's obviously no mention of any UFOs or anything in the sky. So there was pretty complete evidence that it was just a benign photo of a snow structure with a piece of wood in it. Whereas most people that claimed the photo was a UFO claimed it was a cloud in the sky and there was a ship, but it was really just a piece of wood peeking out of a ice structure.
It really does look like that. I mean, it really does look like a UFO. I can understand why people thought that, but I mean, really to totally jump to the conclusion that it is. I mean, I guess if I saw it, my first thought would be is that, wow, this is got to be a UFO, but I don't know. I'd have to really look into it before I'd actually write something about it. But I guess there's people still claiming that's what it is.
There's still a few people, and it's important to mention too that the photo when it was originally circulated was a heavily cropped, low-res image. It wasn't the actual stereoscopic photograph. So when most people looked at it, it was very hard to tell exactly what you were looking at. But once the actual photo, because there's a number of them available, you can even sometimes find them on eBay from that particular set. Once we got a good high-res copy of the actual stereoscopic photo from, I believe, the New York Public Library, you can see the surface of the mountain in the background. You can see clearly, distinctly, you can differentiate between the sky and the surface of the mountain. So once you're able to look at the stereoscopic photo as opposed to the low-res crop, it becomes more apparent.
Yeah, right. Yeah. All right. So I think that is actually on your blog too, isn't it?
Yep, that's on that article is right on my blog.
And let's talk about that's New Hampshire. That's NH UFO. Is it research? Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Give out
New
the
Hampshire UFO Research.blogspot.com.
Ah, okay.
Is the site currently?
And is that an active site that you update?
I do. I haven't updated it much lately. I'm actually working on a newer refurbished site, something a little bit better. So I've been working on that, but I don't update it very often unless I have a new research article that I post, or there's some new news as far as New England or New Hampshire UFOs. I'll post that on there, but I don't tend to update it on like a weekly basis. It's mainly just a place for whenever I do a new research article, I'll post it there.
Uh-huh. Okay, so let's talk about New Hampshire as far as the activity on a scale of population and all that. What is the activity like any of the reports?
Do you mean just across time or in contemporary?
Yeah, in general, yeah, across time, sure.
I mean, there's, New Hampshire has a rich UFO history. From 1947 up to present, there has been a lot of UFO reports, and there have been a lot of very credible UFO reports from police and military witnesses, as well as very credible citizens and local politicians, things of that nature. So New Hampshire has had a lot of UFO sightings, a lot of credible and fascinating ones over the last 60 years. So I think there's been quite a bit of sightings.
Now, I wasn't familiar with the earlier ones, like the 47. Was this when everybody was seeing them, right after or right around the Roswell time?
Yeah, right around the Roswell time, surprisingly, there was a bunch of UFO sightings in New Hampshire right around the time of Roswell. And actually, one of which that comes to mind, it was actually the governor in New Hampshire at the time's son and a companion, and they were both ex-military pilots, and they had a sighting in New Hampshire in the skies while flying the week of Roswell. So, and there's been sightings, before Roswell, but there's been sightings in New Hampshire right back to 1947, right up to present.
Wow. And, of course, there's the Betty Hill case, Betty and Barney Hill, pretty famous as far as New Hampshire goes. And I'm trying to think of Exeter Incident, or Incident Exeter, or whatever it's called. That's probably the top sighting, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, Betty and Barney Hill and the Incident Exeter are really the two landmark New Hampshire cases. Those are the ones that, most people are familiar with. Via books and, movies and pop culture. Not so much Incident Exeter. That case, got a lot of notoriety in the 60s around the time that it happened, but you don't necessarily hear it mentioned very often, in conversations, though.
Yeah, but incredible case for the listener who has not heard that. Can you go ahead and tell them about the Exeter case?
Sure. Well, it was September 3rd, 1965, and a young man named Norman Muscarello was hitchhiking home. He was 18, he had just finished school, and he was about to enter the Navy. And he was hitchhiking on a back road in Kensington, New Hampshire, which is right next to Exeter. The actual UFO sighting happened in Kensington, but the case is just called the Incident Exeter because that's the biggest town near where it happened, and also the police that were involved were from Exeter. And so Norman was hitchhiking home. It was late at night, around 1 or 2 in the morning, and as he was passing a farmhouse, he noticed a red object in the sky that started swooping down at him. He dove in a ditch next to a wall to take cover, and then went and frantically banged on the door of the farmhouse. People were home, but they wouldn't answer the door because it was so late, and they were probably like, why is this guy knocking on our door? And so at any rate, Norman kind of hunched there or waited and then saw a car coming down the road. So he jumped out, flagged the car down, and had them bring him to the Exeter police station. Now, in another part of Exeter, while that was happening, Officer Eugene Bertrand was on patrol, and he came across a car that was parked on the side of the road, and he got out, to investigate, checked it out, and it turned out there was a woman and her daughter in the car that were crying and they were distraught, and they claimed that a red object was swooping down at their vehicle. So when Norman came into the police station and said, look, I just saw this object swooping down at me, the desk officer was like, wow, because he had just gotten word from Officer Bertrand about what, the stop he had made to help the ladies and what they were saying. So the desk officer, Scratch Toland, and Eugene Bertrand, the officer, they decided that the best thing to do was for Officer Bertrand to go back out to the field with Norman and take a look and see if anything, was still up there. So Norman and Officer Bertrand drove back to the field. They walked out into the field, and just a few minutes after walking out into the field, an object came up over the trees, over them in the field, and according to the officer, was approximately 100 feet over them. Now, Officer Bertrand instinctively dropped to his knee and drew his revolver, but then realized that was kind of a bad idea, and Norman froze. So Officer Bertrand grabbed Norman. They ran back to the cruiser. They radioed base saying, I'm seeing this thing too. As that happened, there was another officer, David Hunt, who was on patrol. He heard the call, so he raced to the scene, and him and Officer Bertrand stood there and watched this object for, I believe it was approximately 8 to 10 minutes as it took off in the distance. And the object was silent. It cast a red glow across the field and the farmhouse. And it was red, but there was also bright light, so they had a hard time making out the actual form of the craft. So that was the sighting that they had.
Amazing sighting. And let's address if anyone is searching for that incident right now, you'll see something like 40-year-old case solved, Exeter incident, talks about a refueler. It really doesn't match what any of the witnesses were saying. But when someone writes that, it's solved, it sure gets a lot of attention.
It does, yes. That's an article that was written by skeptic Joe Nickel and James Magaha, both kind of career skeptics, if you'd probably call them. And they put that article out in 2011, and I've released a rebuttal article to that, which is on my site. And, just to speak a little bit to that, they, for their article claiming to solve the Exeter case, they had a total of 13 sources, 10 of which were UFO books. One was a UFO newsletter, one was a UFO article, and one was a TV show. They really, they didn't do their research on the case. When I did my rebuttal article, which is on my site, and, I'll kind of point out some of the main points that point to the fact that, they really didn't solve the case. But, like, my rebuttal, I had 26 sources, 10 of which were Air Force Project Blue Book documents, one of which was the Congressional Hearing number 55, which was in 1966. Congress actually had a hearing on UFOs, and the Exeter case was one of the key cases. And so my point being is I also used Raymond Fowler, who was the primary investigator on the Exeter case, his 100-page file, the Blue Book documents. So all of these things that I used in my rebuttal to the article, these are all things that are available for anybody out there. And for some reason, these skeptics that wrote the article, they didn't access any of this information, which is the core information on Exeter is Raymond Fowler's report and the Project Blue Book documents. That's the core of the case. So they didn't even bother to access that information when they wrote their rebuttal, and they just came to a conclusion that, oh, it sounds like it was a KC-97 refueling jet, and they really didn't offer anything to back up their claim that that's what it was.
I think they said something like there was one flying that night or something like that.
Yeah, no, they never provided any proof of that. And interestingly enough, if you read the Blue Book documents on Exeter, one of the first things they did was, because at the time Pease was a SAC nuclear base, so this is not the sort of area where you're going to have unknown things flying around, or even military aircraft that are not accounted for typically. So one of the first things that Blue Book did was, in Pease, was look at, did we have anything in the area? And when J. Allen Hynek got involved, he even asked that the crew of a plane that was flying, somewhere near that time was interrogated. And ultimately, they didn't provide any information that there was a KC-97 in the area. And while Pease could have had a KC-97, they started phasing those out in '58 for the KC-135. So they weren't even able to prove that there was a KC-97 at Pease, let alone that there was one flying that night. So that's the first problem. Then the other big problems is they also ignored that the two officers, Bertrand and Hunt, Officer Bertrand had been in the Air Force and had 4 years refueling KC-97s. So you talk about having a witness. Not only is he a police officer, but he was in the Air Force and he refueled KC-97. So he was in a unique position to be able to identify all sorts of aircraft. And Officer Hunt had been in the Army Reserves for 6 years, and both of them had been patrolling Exeter for quite some time, so they were familiar with the typical air traffic in the area. So, that was another thing that they completely ignored. Among other things, I can mention as well.
Now, did you try to post a link to your article or anything like that under their claim?
No, I don't tend to do that. Whenever I do a research article that kind of counters something that somebody else is saying, people always say, "Oh, did you send that over to them?" And I didn't because I'm familiar with the two individuals that wrote it, and I don't know that much constructive dialogue would come from it. I'm sure that they've probably seen it. I've never heard any feedback from them, but I'm more of the sort of person, I like to do the research, write up something, and just put it out there, and let people make the decision for themselves.
Well, what do you suppose it is that someone like them would write something like that without, just making broad brushstroke claims like that?
Well, I think what it is I think when you're a career skeptic, you kind of, your job in a way is to kind of poo-poo things. And if you read the article, they basically have like a brainstorm session, decide that, oh, it's a KC-97, and then they refer to themselves as the Hardy Boys, and then they proceed to not show any evidence for what they're claiming. So it's anyone that reads the article can tell that it wasn't really done from a impartial research standpoint. So I think that's like the big problem.
Yeah, that's unfortunate though, that because anyone that wants to look into that case, that's one of the, I believe, if you Google that incident, it's one of the first things that come up.
I know, and that's why I wrote the article, and I also did a presentation for the 50th anniversary at Exeter, and basically it was a PowerPoint presentation based on my article, showing all the evidence, showing the actual Blue Book documents, showing all the evidence right up on the screen so everybody can see it, to show that, what they're saying just doesn't jive with what the Air Force, Pease Air Force Base, and Project Blue Book said. So, I've tried to do my part to get the word out, but you're right, it is unfortunate that they can just write that article, not use any of the primary sources for the case that are readily available for free on the internet, and then a lot of people go and read that and they think, oh, it was just the KC-97. Oh, well.
Right.
So it's unfortunate.
I mean, the Exeter Festival is free. It's put on by, what is it, the Lions Club or something like that?
It's the Kiwanis. It's actually not free. It was free for the first 3 or 4 years. What they're doing now is they do. I mean, it's a very good deal, and all the money goes. They give all the money to charity. So, I believe what they're doing this year is there's like an admission button, and it's maybe $10. I'm not sure, but it's for both days. So it's it's not bad in the sense you get a nice memento, you get admission for both days, and then the money money's going to help kids charity. So it's a nice thing. Yeah,
and there's some pretty good speakers there every year that I've seen. I like going there.
Yeah,
it's a pretty little town in New Hampshire.
Yeah, Exeter is great. I mean, it's a lot of old brick architecture. The town hall is very historic. Abraham Lincoln spoke there. And actually, the connection to the case is that the Exeter Police Station was actually in the back of the town hall building at the time when the UFO sighting happened. So the town hall actually has a little significance in the story as well.
Mm-hmm. Now, are there any witnesses still around from that incident?
Let's see. Well, both the officers in Norman have passed away. So as far as the 3 primary witnesses, they have passed. But there were people in the area that saw things that night and around the time period that are still alive. But all of the primary people have now passed away.
Wow. Now, was this something that occurred at another time as well, or was it a one-time deal?
As far as in Exeter?
Yeah, or that, did anyone else, how you hear a lot of times like an object will appear, several times for some reason. Did anything like that happen with this?
Well, actually, the Exeter area has had a big history of that area where it happened, has a big history of UFO sightings in the 60s. And so, yes, that area has been a big hotbed, and so much so that John Oswald, who's one of the UFO researchers that worked with Ray Fowler in the 60s, 70s, and 80s in New Hampshire, he actually moved to Exeter as a young man and scientist as well to investigate and research UFOs. There were so many sightings in that particular area at one point that he was involved with what's called the Madar Project, which they set up, I believe it was about 15 electromagnetic sensors over that area in Exeter and Kensington, and we're trying to be able to correlate changes with these electromagnetic sensors with reported UFO sightings. So there was quite a few, and then actually just a year or so after the Exeter case, there was another big sighting with some of the same officers involved. So, yeah, there was a lot going on in that area. Yeah.
What was that sighting about?
That sighting, there was a policeman was downtown checking doors, as I guess police used to do in the old days. They would go around downtown and make sure all the businesses were locked, and he basically saw an object in the sky drop significantly, almost like dropping out of the stars, and then it dropped and then just stopped and was hovering and was near some power lines. And so he called into base and said, hey, can you have somebody come down and bring some binoculars? I'm looking, I've got something here I'm looking at. And coincidentally, there was a reporter from, I believe it was the Manchester Union Leader that was hanging out at the police station. So a few people went down and met this officer, and they were able to observe this object in the distance through binoculars, and they watched it for quite some time.
Wow. Now, the way a bird flies, it's about 10 miles away from Pease Air Force Base. Wouldn't you say something like that?
Yeah, it's very close.
Yeah. And which will lead into a topic we're going to talk about now. Pease Air Force is one of the decommissioned air bases. It's now like a park for businesses, things like that. And I grew up in the area, actually lived across the river on a beautiful home. I was lucky enough to grow up in that oversaw the whole river, and we could see the air base right across from where I grew up. So my sisters and I would sit on the hill. We'd see weather balloons and all kinds of stuff over there. And there was something always intriguing about Pease. There was a lot of activity there all the time. There was a crash, I remember, an I forget what it was, the jet that crashed there. I remember it clearly. The whole house shook. Chandeliers were shaking back and forth, all that.
Oh, wow. What year was that?
I don't know. I'm sure you could find it online, but I was just a little kid.
Look that up.
Yeah. So let's talk about Pease. You've uncovered something about UFOs.
Yeah, well, it's good because it kind of stems off of the Exeter case. So when the Exeter case happened in 65, typically most Air Force bases had a designated officer that was a UFO desk officer that would communicate with Project Blue Book if there was any sightings or anything. So almost every base, it was a known thing that bases would have a UFO officer. But when the Exeter sighting happened, what was odd about it was they didn't have a UFO officer, or at least they claimed that they did. And what they did is they had Lieutenant Brandt, who was the information officer, and a Lieutenant or Major Griffin. They were two gentlemen on the base. They were appointed to look into it. So one of the big questions after Exeter in the aftermath was, does Pease have a UFO investigative officer? Because they, kind of skirted whether they had an actual one, and they'd sent out Lieutenant Brandt and Griffin. So flash to, the Pease connection. While going through Project Blue Book documents online, I just one day stumbled across a document that was a communication between Pease and Project Blue Book, and just looking over the document, I looked down and I noticed that it said it was signed UFO Investigative Officer. And, I'd never seen this as far as anything pertaining to New Hampshire, that sort of signature in the documents. So, I was intrigued by it. And so basically I did a little research, and it turns out that this gentleman, who was at the time he was a major, but he retired a colonel, Colonel Frank Junes Jr., he was Pease's UFO investigative officer in 1967. So, being one of the big questions after Exeter, did they actually have a UFO investigative officer at Pease? This is the first proof that there was one there. So it was a great find, very fascinating.
Wow. Now, I spoke to someone that was at Pease for a long time. I can't remember, he was a captain, but I don't really know if he was when he first got there. But I actually was brave enough to ask him if he'd ever heard anything about UFOs at Pease, and he said, well, not that I can think of. I mean, he sounded like he'd be open to the idea, but so I'm sure something like that isn't just another thing that is a need-to-know type of thing if something would occur, you would think.
Yeah, well, definitely. And what's interesting is about Colonel Junes is that when I started looking into him and who he was, I mean, he was at peace with the 509th Bomb Group, which is the most elite bomb group that we have. They're the bomb group that dropped the nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So this is, the elite of the elite nuclear bomber squad. So he was a major and pilot with them at the time. So that carries a lot of weight. And then looking into his history as a pilot, he flew in World War II, he flew in Vietnam, he flew in Korea, and in World War II, he flew with the 360th, who was bombing over occupied Germany. So, not only was this gentleman with the 509th a major, but he was a highly decorated pilot who had flown in 3 wars. So, just to stress, how reputable of a gentleman he was. That makes it even more interesting, just, finding out his history and just, he wasn't just some, private that they had on a desk, emailing or not emailing, but sending letters to Blue Book. He was actually, a highly decorated pilot.
Wow. Interesting. Now, when you found this, did you also find cases that he was working on besides possibly Exeter?
Well, the thing is we don't know for sure that he was working on Exeter. All we do know is that in 1967, at that time, he was, working as the UFO investigative officer. Unfortunately, and it's still an ongoing thing where I'm working on getting more information. I've actually, luckily, been able to get a hold of his family, so I'm hoping to work with them a little bit more, to fill in the blanks. So, so we don't know that he was necessarily the UFO officer then, but we do know he was in 1967, so we do know that much.
Wow, interesting. As I said earlier, it always seemed very intriguing as a kid to look across at Pease. Do you know did they ever do any aircraft testing, or did you ever look into any of that?
I haven't heard anything on testing. I just know that, throughout the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, it was a SAC nuclear base. It was very active. It was used in certain capacities during certain conflicts, and I believe even the Iraq War. So I don't know that I've ever heard any of actual aircraft testing there. It's been more refueling operations, things of that nature.
Yeah. And it's a 10,000-foot runway. It's one of the places designated for the, back when the shuttle was flying, one of the places it could land, was available to land. And I don't think there were a lot of the air bases that had a strip that long. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I don't think so. They're actually, reviving the base part a bit. They're going to be receiving some new Boeing refueling planes, military refueling planes, and they actually just had to, I believe they had to do some refurb to actually be able to fit these new Boeing jets that they're getting into the hangars. So it seems like, Pease is seeing a little bit of a revitalization as far as being a base, so that's pretty interesting.
Oh, wow. Didn't know that. Actually, I saw this huge jet last time I went through the area. I don't know what it was. It was like a big cargo. It looked like a cargo jet or something. I've never seen one in person, only like on, TV or something like that. It was all green, so definitely military. And I think that closed back in the 80s, early 80s, something like that.
Yeah, I believe it was the early. No, I believe actually it may have been the 90s, like 90, 91. It kind of teeter-tottered back and forth. Initially, they were going to close it completely, and then I think what they did was they moved some of the bomb groups out of there and kind of brought it to limited capacity. There's a whole history with that as well. But I believe it was either early 80s or I think it was early 90s, I believe.
Well, let's talk about some other intriguing New England cases that you've looked into, and I think of I can't really think of any right now other than the ones that we were talking about earlier, Exeter incident. So are there some other ones that you've really looked into?
Yeah, there's a few we can talk. I mean, there's plenty of cases. Because basically what I do with New Hampshire UFO Research is, I go and research sightings and cases, and I go to archives and use microfilms. And basically, what I'm trying to do is develop a history and a timeline of credible UFO sightings in New Hampshire from 1947 up till present. And so there's been a lot of UFO sightings in New Hampshire, just sheer volume. But some of the other ones I can talk about, probably the next one that comes to mind after Exeter, which I think is an amazing case, is the Zeller incident. Now, the Zeller incident, this was October 15th, 1984, and it actually took place in Keene, New Hampshire. And Officer Zeller was at the police station, and he received a call saying there's something hovering over Keene. And so he was pretty skeptical about it, but he had to go check it out. So he jumped in his cruiser, drove down, through the city, and then took a left onto the Route 12, which is kind of an interstate road, highway-type road. And as soon as he turned onto the road, he saw the car coming towards him veer off the road, and the people jump out, and they started pointing at the sky. So Officer Zeller pulled over, and there was this object hovering just up in the sky about 500 to 700 feet up, making no sound. And it was green, red, and it had like white pulsating lights. So Officer Zeller and the people just kind of stood there and observed it, and a crowd of about 30 people gathered because people were driving. This is a pretty busy road, so people were driving by in both directions and, obviously saw the officer's cruiser and the people standing and pointing and looking. And it's a pretty wide open area. There's not a lot of trees there, so it's actually a great place to be observing something because it is wide open, whereas most in New Hampshire, there's, a lot of trees. So at any rate, they were observing the object, and finally the officer decided he was going to point his spotlight on the object. As soon as he pointed the spotlight on the object, it began to move towards the cruiser and also descend. So at that point, the people that were watching got a little bit alarmed and apparently started running and, grab your shotgun and, kind of freaking out. And the Officer Zeller was like, no, I'm just going to wait this out. And he stood there as this thing floated over his cruiser, and, he shined the light on the bottom of it, tried to figure out what it was. It was a very odd object from his description. It was cream-colored with blunt ends, and as it went over the cruiser, it made a two-tone hum, whereas, prior they hadn't heard any noise coming out of it, and it just floated over the cruiser, floated by them, went over by the Ramada Inn, and it was gone.
Huh. Wow, amazing.
And, yeah, and it's an amazing case, too, because, with a lot of UFO sightings, there's not often news coverage as far as newspaper articles or even the news coming down and talking to witnesses. And what's great about this case is there was a number of good articles written in the paper about it, interviewing Officer Zeller, and, he always was very matter of fact. He's, I'm not saying it was a spaceship or a UFO. It was just a flying object that I have no idea what it was. And, he always stood by that what he saw wasn't an airplane or anything else. And he was also interviewed by the Evening News right at the spot where he had the sighting, and gave a detailed account. So I was able to get that, from my archives as well. So, it's a great case in the sense that it was a police officer, multiple witnesses, a wide open area, very credible officer, and it's just a very intriguing case.
What year was this again?
This was October 15, 1984.
1984. Wow. Yeah, that is. I always love it when there's police officers, and I remember having a conversation with Seth Shostak, and mentioned to him, well, what about astronauts, police officers, witnesses like that? And he said, well, they're no more credible witness than anyone else. What makes them any better? Do they have training? Stuff like that. And actually, yes, most astronauts do have training of aircraft anyway, because they usually, they're all pilots to begin with, I believe.
Yeah, I've heard a few skeptics say that, and it kind of makes me laugh because a police officer's job is to observe and report to a certain degree. So, and a police officer, whether it's a crime or any incident, they have to write a detailed report about what happened. So, I think the idea that police officers or even an astronaut who is a great enough pilot that they're sent into space, I think the idea that someone of their intelligence and training and experience isn't any better of a witness, I don't agree with that at all.
Yeah. Now, when you and I have chatted on the phone a number of times, and I've heard you say you consider yourself a serious researcher. And can you kind of explain what you do? It seems like you just were mentioning earlier, you go way back and you try to get all the information you can. Can you kind of explain how you do your research?
Sure. And when I specified that, I guess what I was commenting on is within ufology or UFO research right now, there's a lot of people that claim to be researchers or these sort of thing, and unfortunately right now there's a lot of people out there that they're really not doing much research. They're not going to archives, they're not sitting in front of a microfilm reader, they're not specifying on a particular aspect of UFOs, which early on, that's one of the things that I decided I was going to do was focus on New Hampshire specifically, also New England because it's my periphery, but so that was the first thing that I did was have a focus, which I think is a good thing for people to do in UFO research because there's so many different aspects of it and there's so much stuff going on. I think sometimes if you can just take a little chunk and focus on it, it's a good thing for people to do. Like there's Stan Gordon in Pennsylvania. He, has for decades has been kind of the guy down there doing UFO investigation and research. There's also Ted Phillips who specializes in landing trace cases. So early on, I decided that I wanted to have a focus, and that's why I decided to focus on one state, New Hampshire. And so as far as explaining how I do my research, I use a number of credible sources to find UFO sightings, and I document those, and then I search for other sources on those same sightings, whether it be newspaper articles, TV, radio, credible internet sources, military or Air Force documents. And that's basically what I do. And sometimes it involves interviewing witnesses. And then what I do is accumulate that information and have it stored for people. If they need information, they can contact me.
Uh-huh. And it'll be on a lot of the information's on your blog, or most of it is, right?
No, not at the time. On my blog right now, I have research articles that I've written over the last 5 years, but actually taking all of the data that I'm talking about now, like all of the hundreds of newspaper articles I have and different things, eventually I am going to put all that on a website, but that is not up at this point. At this point, I put out research articles, and I'm also available if a researcher has a question about a particular case in New Hampshire. They can contact me, and I'll access that information for them.
Do you find your source of information really difficult to access when it comes to, say, MUFON or places like that?
Yeah, I mean, luckily, I haven't been in too many positions where, I've been in a position where MUFON was, the only person that had something and I had to ask. But, in my experience, just kind of watching MUFON and just, it seems like there's a bit of a conflict between their mission statement and what actually happens. And what I mean by that is, I'm paraphrasing, but, in their mission statement, it says something to the effect of research, gather information on UFOs to give to researchers worldwide. It's something to that effect. And, over the past, 5-10 years, many researchers have talked about trying to request files from MUFON on particular cases for their research, and they've hit brick walls. And there's always kind of a different reason given for why, they won't hand over the files, whether it be they're not scanned, there's confidentiality reasons, there's been different reasons that I've heard. So I've never had too much issue because I've been lucky enough in the cases that I've worked on, I've been able to get the information I need without having to really go to them. But, I just think that a lot of people seem to be having trouble getting, old reports or things for their research. And so, that's really all I can comment on it.
Yeah, sure. I understand. There's controversy a lot of times that, a lot of people have brought up on this show as far as being able to access files and not being able to get to people unless you're on the inside, that part of the STAR team or something like that. Not able to access information, which I understand as far as keeping the witnesses anonymous. I truly do understand that because it gives them a safe haven to report. But also the one thing that, say, Chris Lambright mentioned was that he wanted a case he was investigating. He wanted them to give the person that made the report his information if they wanted to contact him, and they won't do that. So I it's kind of a gray area, but some of it I understand.
Yeah, it's difficult because, obviously confidentiality is a concern. If someone gave them a report and didn't, want it to be confidential, I think, MUFON obviously has to honor that. But with a lot of, I guess from my point of view, a lot of the cases, if I were to contact MUFON about, these would be cases from 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. And so in a lot of cases, a lot of people have passed away, but on top of that, they also can just remove the confidential information. And, for the researcher. And then, so, there's ways around that. So it's tough to really tell. The best part, I know you said you had Jan Harzan on and you may have asked him that. The best people to really ask is MUFON, because I really don't know. I don't know whether if it's confidentiality or it's like a proprietary thing where, they want to just kind of keep the goodies for themselves. I really don't know, so, it's difficult to kind of figure that out, why they're keeping everything so close.
Yeah. Well, there's also conspiracies you hear. I'm sure you hear that a lot. CIA infiltration, or they want to hold for themselves. You hear all that stuff. But I don't personally think that's the case as far as right now. Possibly in the past. There's some, actually, we had Ray Stanford mentioned some firsthand account. He actually confronted Jan Harzan when Harzan was on about a situation he knew about. But I don't know. Now, what about Peter Davenport's site? Does he make his things readily available? Do you know?
Yeah, Peter Davenport. He, takes calls about UFO sightings, and I haven't been on there in a little bit, but typically, the last time I was on there, he'll kind of, I don't know that he's posting things like up to date, like daily, but I believe maybe once every few weeks or so he will put up the sightings that he's had for all the different states. And so, you can go there and just look specifically under New Hampshire or wherever you want. So I don't know that it's added real time, like day to day, but I believe he updates it, every few weeks or a month, I believe.
Yeah. I heard him say recently that he's really frustrated. Now, here's this guy taking all these calls, doing all this work mostly on his own. I mean, real dedication. And he's getting prank calls constantly. And I think that it's probably, it sounds like it would be only one person doing it or maybe a few people doing it. But he said that he had over 45 prank calls in one afternoon, which is really wearing. So
Wow.
He's trying to figure out a way to change the hotline so he doesn't have to deal with that. And hopefully he won't shut it down totally.
Yeah, no, that's unfortunate. I have heard him on shows, saying that he has to, deal with that. And that's unfortunate because, besides MUFON, who takes reports, National UFO Reporting Center is the only other place online that really fields and posts about UFO sightings. So it's unfortunate to hear that people are giving him trouble,
Yeah. I wrote him the other day because there's a way to block prank calls from prank call services. They actually have services. Can you believe that?
Oh, wow.
I think there's 12 of them, and you can block your number from the services. But I don't know why anyone would even create a service for prank calls. It's silly.
Yeah.
Anyway, we're off
unfortunate.
topic. That last UFO case you mentioned was really interesting, and I had someone mention a case to me, and perhaps you're aware of it. It was either in 76 or 79. It was in New England, in Massachusetts, and it was a triangle sighting, and it hit the papers. This girl explained it to me. It's someone I know outside of the UFO topic. She actually was a secretary at an auction gallery I was at, and she said that she was with her aunt, I think, and someone else, and they saw this triangle in the road over them, and the aunt got out of the car, and she's like yelling, get back in, and just stopped over their car, and basically when they moved, it moved. And then it shot off. She said it shot off really fast. She couldn't remember if it was 76 or, exactly in that time. But she did say that it was in the newspaper the next day because other people saw it. Are you familiar with the triangle from the 70s?
I am. Now, I can't be sure with that little amount of info, but there was one from 79 that involved a triangular-shaped object, and so they very well may be that case. I believe it was May of 79, or April maybe. So yeah, there that time period. If it's the same time period, it's interesting because the case I'm thinking of, there was actually 2 Boston radio personalities who were driving and saw this large object. And some people described it as triangle. Some of the reports are almost like a baseball diamond, almost like home plate, where it's triangle in the front and then squared in the back. And so these 2 guys, radio guys, saw this thing, and they were just like, what is that? And so they didn't say anything, and then they started hearing reports the next day. So then they decided, hey, we should probably come forward and say what we saw. And so that was actually, there's actually a news piece on YouTube about that. There's a video about that I could send over if you want a link to, where they're interviewed about it. And they were actually part of a documentary that was done. And now I'm probably going to forget the name, but there's a specific area in Massachusetts that's had a lot of, UFO sightings and paranormal things. So there's a particular triangle.
Bridgewater.
They call it the The Bridgewater Triangle, yes. So this sighting that I'm thinking of with the triangular object was covered in that documentary, the Bridgewater Triangle.
Yeah. Yeah, that's... I had Aaron, I'm trying to remember his name on, that did that documentary, and yeah, it's a very interesting area. You know, I wore that shirt, T-shirt he gave me somewhere, and someone stopped me and said, "Oh, I know all about that," and I was like out of state, so it's kind of quite a reputation.
Wow, that's interesting.
Yeah. But you know, most of it are paranormal.
Yeah, to have somebody, it's kind of an obscure, thing, the Bridgewater Triangle, so to have somebody out of state recognize that's interesting.
Right. Does my audio sound distorted?
Yeah, your audio just went a little distorted on me.
Okay. I'm going to have to let you do some talking. So why don't you talk about another case?
I'm sorry, say that again, Martin?
Until this clears up, can you talk about some other cases?
Sure. Another great case that involves a police officer from New Hampshire that I've looked into a little bit is it was October 31st, 1983, which is Halloween. So this particular case was in Rochester, New Hampshire, and basically what happened was a police officer spotted an object hovering in the sky, and so he took notice and he drove over to the local drive-in and was observing the object. He shined his light at the object, and when he shined the light at the object supposedly darted across the sky and changed its position quickly and then took off. And then there was also a local town councilor or someone with the local town government that also phoned in a report. And then there was 4 or 5 other individual civilian reports of a UFO that night. And on top of all that, the power went out in the area that this UFO was spotted that particular night. So that one's very interesting because, the officer was observing the object. He shined a light. He seemed to think the object was reacting to his light. There was a bunch of independent local citizen witnesses. And so, it's a pretty compelling case. And, with that one, it gets murky because, one of the things that in New Hampshire, when there is a UFO sighting, air operations from P's, often when these UFO sightings are discussed in the papers, those are what are, used as an explanation. Now, I mean, it very well could be that. But in this particular case, the police officer as well as the citizen witnesses were very adamant that whatever they were seeing did not appear to be a military craft, and it was very low, and it was odd-shaped, and it was, moving not like a typical craft. So that one's interesting where you have a police officer witness, you have citizen witnesses, and then you have the power outage in that area, which, wasn't explained. So that one's pretty interesting as well.
Wow. Sounds like my audio might be back. So it's really interesting that there's 2 cases you're talking about where an officer or someone put a flashlight toward a craft or whatever it was, and it reacted. And the same thing is for the Allagash case up in Maine, where Charlie Fultz said he flashed his light back, flickered it at the craft, and then it came after them, and the rest is history. That was an incredible case. Have you ever looked into that one?
I have. I've read about it. Being a fan of Raymond Fowler and his work in New England, I've read the book, and it is definitely an interesting case.
It seems like it's ongoing too. There's things happening to those 4 guys still to this day, which is pretty amazing. Just like the whole thing had changed their lives, and that's such an incredible case. For the person who hasn't heard that, it was, what was that, in 79 or something like that?
That sounds about right.
Yeah,
that
I might have.
I'm not sure.
May have the time off, but basically 4 people were up in the Allagash, which is a series of chain lakes connected by streams and things like that. It's just an incredible case. I really encourage the listener who has not heard about it, just Google it and check it out. They basically forgot everything for about 10 years, I think it was, and the whole thing came back to them. And the one thing that they all remembered right off when they got back from their canoe trip, that the fire had died down, which was an impossibility, and that was their missing time, basically. Really great story. All right. So we have about, about 20 minutes left, something like that. What would you consider the most recent interesting case that you've looked into?
Let's see. I tend to not look into more recent cases. Not that I won't look into them, but there's really, as far as lately, there's not really anything that comes to mind. Say as far as 2016, 2015, recently, newer cases. Although I was just recently contacted by someone about an older case, and at this point, I've been going through New Hampshire UFO cases for so long that, I tend to, when I go through, my notes and my archives, most cases I've seen something about, a New Hampshire case, even if I'm not the more major cases I'm pretty well versed in, but, somebody saw something in the sky, the little blurb cases that don't have much to research, I have those documented, but I don't spend a lot of time on those. And I actually had a lady contact me about a case from the early 90s that's really fascinating. I can tell you a little bit about. I'm still actually working on it, so I don't have like a full detailed, but it's intriguing nonetheless. I can share that with you.
Yeah, why don't you?
Okay. Well, early 90s, there was, I believe it was 91, there was a particular sighting where at 2 or 3 in the morning, all sorts of people from Virginia to Canada were seeing things streak across the sky. And so between 2:50 and 3 in the morning, there was a bunch of reports of kind of fireballs or UFOs or odd-looking things. So that sighting ended up being determined that it was like a fireball, that was seen from Virginia to Maine. But about 6 hours later at 9 a.m. in New Hampshire, up in the mountains, a gentleman was in his house with his housekeeper just there, and all of a sudden they spotted something in the sky. And this object was almost flying down the side of the mountain that they lived near, almost along the mountain heading towards the bottom of it. And it was leaving this white and yellow ribbon in its path. So, they were watching and they're like, what is this? So the gentleman sent his housekeeper to go get neighbors and get more people because they wanted other people to see it. So they went and got a bunch of other people who also witnessed it, and basically it took about 5 minutes or so to make its descent, and then when it got towards the bottom of the mountain, it either stopped or landed and stayed in this spot for about 15 minutes, and then smoke started coming from this area, and they were able to see blinking lights, and the object itself was like a yellow, almost sun-like object. So the object got to the bottom, stayed there for about 15 minutes, and then it was gone. And so the police were called. The police didn't see the object, but they saw the smoke rising from the area, and the police took it very seriously. So they actually sent a plane and a helicopter up to the mountain to check this particular area. And this is, where things get a bit murky. Supposedly they didn't find anything when they sent the plane, and the helicopter up, but the police chief at the time who was interviewed about this sighting, even after they had sent the airplane and the air up there to look, and there was a few expeditions, I believe, by MUFON at the time to go up and try and see if there was anything in the woods. Even after all that, it was funny because the police chief in the paper was like, one of these days we should really go up there with some four-wheelers and give things a more thorough look. So, once again, the police took it really serious. They sent the helicopter and the plane up there, and it just seemed like the police chief, still wasn't completely satisfied, maybe with the search or whatnot. So that's one that I hadn't heard of, and it just goes to show, even when you've been doing something like this for a long time, just when you think you've heard of every great case in your particular area or whatever, someone can contact you and just tell you about something, and then boom, you find out about a case like this, which is great because there's credible witnesses. It's not characteristic of a normal aircraft or of a meteor. And with the smoke and, all those things, it's a very compelling case.
Did they think the object itself was smoking, or did they think it was like a fire started?
Well, they were viewing this, the gentleman and his housekeeper, the initial people, they were viewing it from 8 or 9 miles away. So it was really hard for them, to determine exactly what was going on. They just really did their best to kind of describe what they were seeing. So it was really hard for them, they know that smoke was rising, but I don't believe they saw any fire. So yeah, it's a bit murky.
Mm-hmm. Now, have you looked into the Betty and Barney Hill case yourself?
I have. I've done a good amount of research on it. I tend to, shy away from, I definitely will talk about it with you right now if you'd like. I tend to shy away from it just because, obviously Kathleen Martin and Stanton Friedman, obviously talk a lot about Betty and Barney Hill, and they're the experts on that. So I feel like they tend to cover, most of the ground on that case. But definitely, did you have a question about it?
Well, I just wondered if you ever looked at the I can't remember his name. He was writing, kind of debunking the whole thing. I wondered if you've ever looked into that at all. Are you familiar with he's saying the Jack-o'-lantern restaurant and the light up on top of the mountain?
Oh, you mean somebody's claiming that it was like a skeptic is claiming that it was a light on the mountain?
Yeah.
I have heard that. I believe there was one person trying to say it was a light on Cannon Mountain. Yeah, I have heard that. I don't, I've researched the case thoroughly, and I don't think that's really feasible. I'm familiar with the area. I spent a bit of time up there when I was a kid, and it's just it doesn't seem like a very feasible explanation.
I asked Stan Friedman when he was on last week what he had to say about Dr. Simon saying that he didn't believe that they were actually abducted. And that was from someone that made a personal call, a listener to the show, to Simon when he was alive. And he said that Simon was just under a great deal of pressure. And, he did Stan obviously claimed that he addressed this in some book on how he was under such pressure not to agree that they were actually abducted for his career. I don't know if you ever heard anything about that.
I don't know that I've heard that, but it sounds very possible. And, I do know that Dr. Simon was very credible, and, I know that, he approached it very seriously, and, I've heard the tapes myself, and, Barney Hill's, his tape is probably one of the more terrifying things you could ever hear.
Yes.
Really. So I don't know. I think that, with a case like the Hill case, there's, there's always going to be somebody popping up with a new, Dr. Simon this, or, there's going to always be new things. But, I think ultimately it's, people need to have more, if they're going to make a claim like it's a light on Cannon Mountain or, anything like that, they should have a bit more, to back it up than just going back and, Dr. Simon said somewhere in an interview, so that's really all I could say about that.
Well, I think that the one thing that really helps that whole case a lot is they didn't want to go public with it. It was leaked, and that's how the whole thing, really evolved.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, you're right. First off, it happened in 61, and didn't go public, I believe, until, was it 66, I believe, 65, 66. So there was a whole 5-year period between when the event happened and when it actually went public. And as you said, they weren't looking to get public with it. And also on top of that, Betty and Barney were very credible, intelligent people in the community. They both had good jobs. They were very involved in civil rights. So, they were very credible people. I think all of those things, are what make the case so compelling. The fact that it didn't go public for 5 years, and they weren't necessarily looking for publicity on it. I think that's some of the stronger things about that case.
Yeah, and it's a landmark. It's actually, I mentioned this to someone before. I can't remember who it was, and said it's like the first well-known abduction case. And I guess there was one in the 20s, which I was kind of surprised, like 1926. Something happened that was very similar. I don't know if you've ever heard about that.
Do you know where?
No.
In New Hampshire or somewhere else?
No, this was somewhere else. But,
okay.
I shouldn't really talk about it unless I have the facts in front of me. I really don't remember the information on it. But anyway, it was really, the Hill case is really one of the, foundations of, I think, what you hear about a lot. And I'm not really sure about the abduction thing. I go back and forth all the time. Just the fact that so many people are claiming it is just, to me, I don't know. What's your thoughts on the whole abduction?
My thoughts on abduction, I try and kind of approach things from a center of gravity. So as far as, abductions, I'm open-minded but skeptical is probably the best way to describe my opinion of abductions. As far as New Hampshire UFO Research goes, I mainly try and focus on police and military sightings just because I feel like, when bringing research to the public and, talking about cases, I've just found that, cases that involve credible people like police and military, those seem to carry the most weight, when discussing this topic with people. So while I do document any UFO case I come across or abduction in New Hampshire from my records and my archives, and, there are others that have happened in New Hampshire, allegedly besides the Betty and Barney Hill. There's a few other interesting ones. But so I have a middle approach, middle gravity where I'm open-minded, but I don't spend too much time on them because there's only a handful that have, allegedly happened in New Hampshire. And, for reasons that I just stated, I just find that, the other thing with police and military sightings is there tends to be documents, there's newspaper articles, there's tangibles that I can get a hold of and get information from where, as a researcher, when it comes to abduction cases, the Betty and Barney Hill, there's an enormous amount of information because the Blue Book file is, I think it's about like 100 pages. There's quite a bit of stuff in the Blue Book file. And then obviously there's Interrupted Journey, there's Captured, and there's, a lot of other research and information about the case out there. So that's an abduction case that, can be really thoroughly researched as far as New Hampshire because there's a lot of meat there to be looked into. Whereas most of the other ones is not, as much stuff to look into. So that's pretty much my take on it. I'm open-minded but skeptical about abductions.
Mm-hmm. Excuse me. Well, I think that's going to be about it for the show this week. I know we had a lot of trouble, and I really appreciate the listener for hanging in there, the live listener, with all the audio trouble. Hopefully we'll get that fixed by next week. So I'm really looking forward to see your new website when that comes up. But for now, someone can find your blog. Can you give that address one more time?
Sure. It's New Hampshire UFO Research.blogspot.com. And also, I encourage people to go to my Facebook page, New Hampshire UFO Research. Like that, I post information about research. I also post regularly about space and new aircraft and, all these things that are on the periphery of UFOs, things that it's good for people to educate themselves on, weather, things of that nature. So definitely, go check out the Facebook. And, I appreciate it. Thank you for having me on, Martin.
Yes, and hopefully next time you'll be on, we will not have all these issues.
Well, that's okay. I really appreciate you doing it, and doing it all the way from Russia. I think you did a great job, so thank you.
Well, yeah. Well, thanks. Now, anyway, thanks so much, and we'll be talking to you soon. And all right, everyone, so that's it for the show. And next week we have Arthur Coleman on, and so that's it. Have a good night, and remember to keep your eyes to the sky.